And social political environments. I'm Scott MacLeod. It's July 4th, 2007, and I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The internet is a fundamental communication technology. And the internet is not a technology that determines anything, but it is extremely powerful. When governments and businesses use it, it enhances extremely the possibility to organize. And so far we've seen that it is neither a tool of freedom nor a tool of isolation. People use the internet to strengthen patterns already developed. The prevailing mode of behavior in the network society is individualism due to broader causes of cultural change. So the prevailing model of social behavior that we've seen thus far is individualism. The internet and sociability. The internet fits perfectly into the patterns of individualism that already exist, and therefore the internet reinforces these patterns. Most activity of the internet now is highly commercialized, and because individualism is the prevailing pattern in society and point-to-point communication is a key element in the internet fits perfectly with this pattern of individualism. Social mobilization in politics. How the internet plays into social mobilization is what we'll talk about next. Some observers say the internet is a business tool, and a lot of the internet is business related, which doesn't mean that it is not social. The internet is very social. The internet and social mobilization. These issues are complex. Let's reduce them to some simple steps. Throughout the 1990s, all kinds of social movements started to use the internet early on. For example, the Zapatista movement, which was a Mexican Indian movement organized around white intellectuals in a poor, very poor southern Mexican state. These Indians were first exploited by Spaniards and then by the Mexican government. On January 1st, 1994, the Zapatistas protested the hardship imposed upon the peasants by the North American Treaty and the lack of rights that ensued. This movement was armed, and they attacked and were attacked, and hundreds of people were killed. The Zapatistas never intended to be a threat to the Mexican regime. Why? They didn't have any weapons, they didn't have any training. But the Zapatistas understood that to win, they had to impact public opinion. They had a very sophisticated communication strategy, part of which was symbolic, masks. Masks were worn around the world in solidarity. The aim was to explain to Mexicans what really happened to Mexican Indians. The military classes in Mexico in the mid-90s controlled the television, and they had big media coverage and interviews. In order to organize support, their weapon, the Zapatistas' weapon, was a public opinion movement to stop the Mexican army from killing them. They organized using the internet. A particular committee did this. And this was in the time that the internet was just becoming popular and widespread. So the Zapatistas and the internet. In 1994 to 95, they started to use the internet. Someone would take a disk to a computer in Chiapas, then send the contents to newspapers. There was a connection to San Francisco, and an organization in San Francisco called the Institute for Global Communications, made up of techies, donated time. La Neta. In 1993, a women's group on the computer formed a computer network of Mexican women called La Neta, or the truth, or the real thing. This was a network of Mexican women using resources in different countries, and they were supported by the Catholic Church. From this, the Zapatista movement developed a computer communication network. And the internet, therefore, became a matter of life and death. It became a media event. The Solidarity Committee revolved around the internet. And in February 1995, they sent a message of emergency and solidarity. The White House, as a consequence, in the United States got more than 1 million hits per day on the basis of real-time connections. So, social movements and the internet. The idea is that the internet is a powerful instrument, and social movements today use it. Political activism and fights take place on the internet. For example, Israeli and Palestinian fights. Pro-Palestinian hackers in the mid-90s stole and published Israeli credit cards. Kosovo War. Serbian hackers and pro-Kosovan hackers went back and forth in escalating conflict. And Russian hackers versus pro-Chechen hackers. Internet and politics. Any political conflict now provokes cracking. That is, it prompts an attack in the internet. The typical attack, especially in the mid to late 90s, was take over a website and post contrary propaganda. So the internet is a political battleground, very much, more than in everyday life, because it's more accessible. And this notion reflects a change in the environment. So politics and the internet equal politics on the internet. China has started to develop its Golden Shield project in 1998. The pinyin is Jindun Gongchung, and it's owned by the Ministry of Public Security of the People's Republic of China, and it became operational in November of 2003. And according to the Ministry of Public Security, it's to construct a communication network and computer information system for police to improve their capability and efficiency. And China Central Television, CCTV, until 2002, reported that until 2002, the preliminary work of the Golden Shield project cost $800 million. Chinese government views the Golden Shield as one of the most important projects for ensuring its political power. Known outside mainland China as the Great Firewall of China, in reference both to its role as a network firewall and to the ancient Great Wall of China. The system blocks content by preventing IP addresses from being routed through and consists of standard firewall and proxy servers at the internet gateways. The system also selectively engages in DNS poisoning when particular sites are requested. Government does not appear to be systematically examining internet content, as this appears to be technically impractical. So, looking at the internet and politics, there are three basic connections in terms of social movements and the internet. The first has to do with social movement, social protest on the internet. The second with citizen networks, community participation. And the third with, quote, formal politics, unquote, and the internet. About social movements, protests, and the internet. What's significant here now, in terms of the internet, is the role of values and symbols, for one, the role of networks in social change, and the difference between global and local. 1. Social movements. These collective protests, increasingly organized around changing people's minds rather than taking over institutions, are newly significant. For example, the environmental movement changes the way people think about the connection between their life and society, and similarly between the economy and nature. Social protest. The most important form of social protest is changing the way we think. Then the boycott. So for the women's movement, something similar. Change the way women think about themselves in women's minds, and you have change. Communication becomes important for diffusing ideas and values, e.g. the use of the internet. And most important forms of social mobilization are built around change of values. That's where significant change comes, in change of values. Social change and communication technologies. Therefore, technologies of communication are essential. They offer a very flexible way to influence social change, and they offer the ability to diffuse values which are at the center of the process of social change. Therefore, the ability to use the internet is directly connected to changing the values of society. Social movements and organization. Social movements and organization. Social movements depend on forms of organization, and they're critical. Understanding these organizations, these forms of organization, are critical to understanding change. For example, in the 19th century, there was widespread exploitation of industrial workers. There still is, but in the 19th century, workers weren't organized. And so there was a process to build unions, and there was commonality of interests, which depended on, or leading, based on a commonality of interests, which influenced the ability to organize. The process was dependent on an organizational form called the factory. Factories. Factories created communities of interest and grounds for organizing. The social historian E.E. Thompson showed the relationship between factory and pubs as political organizing centers, which is why Britain closed pubs at 9 p.m. in the 18th century. Both factory and pub are places of work and communication. Ultimately, these led to the institution of unions in industrial societies. 2. Networks. Now people get together on the basis of networks, and forms of organization depend on networks. For example, the movement against globalization, which involves people opposing the development of free trade and the global economy. The most fundamental challenge to new forms of information capitalism is the anti-globalization movement. Anti-globalization movements. Globalization and networks. The anti-globalization movement is saying that it is good for corporations and countries. Some people say the environment is being destroyed, and others say that ethnic minorities are being exploited or destroyed, etc. This is the biggest challenge for corporations and the anti-globalization movement. How the anti-globalization movement has been organized. The most symbolic movement against globalization was in December 1999 in Seattle. Labor, grassroots, and solidarity groups blocked a meeting of the World Trade Organization, WTO, which intended to liberalize trade and open borders to capital and free trade. This induced a big debate through the media. There was a police clash. People understood that a few radical groups can't stop globalization. The movement was organized around the internet first, over many, many months. They built forums for different perspectives. They recorded on email what happened to them. They agreed on a central slogan: no globalization without representation, echoing no taxation without representation. Who decides globalization? In these meetings they asked, who decides globalization? A few WTO, World Trade Organization delegates were in the room. This resulted in debate over months and months. During the Seattle meeting, the Independent Media Center formed. They were a network of people providing video and real-time news over the internet. For example, Professor Manuel Castells received letters during this time from Seattle. Quote, after being beaten by police, they would go to the internet and email him. Castells, that is. Everybody was being his or her reporter in real time. Everybody can create an independent media center. Just all one needs is a password. The Independent Media Center is a network which can work on and offline. Social movements, media, and the internet. After Seattle, similar media centers arose in Washington, Melbourne, Prague, Davos. Without the internet, this type of movement could not have happened. Social movements themselves are shaped by the internet. Stopping networks. There were serious attempts to stop protests through arrests in Seattle during these anti-globalization protests and around this time. But how can you stop a network? This movement swims like a fish in a net. The history of revolutionary movements, in a famous pamphlet by Lenin, quote, when students go on vacation, there's no more activity in our political party, end quote. But networks overcome this challenge. The internet revolution never stops. It allows people to participate and drop out very fluidly. This movement doesn't have a structure or a party. Movements have moved from card-carrying, vertical organizations to very elastic forms of doing things without a party, to a network of mobilization. This is a decisive change. Globalization of movements. The most important thing these days is globalization of movements, not the movement against globalization. For example, the women's movement, the environmental movement, and nationalist movements. Most important is that all kinds of social movements are going global. Labor, women, environmental, church, human rights. Rather than fight locally, people are trying to affect the causes of the movement. For example, global warming requires a coordinated effort from people around the globe. This reverses the old maxim, think global, act local. Change on global level. Rather than fight in one community, people fight and affect change at a global level. What happens is that more and more, rather than thinking globally, people think from their own angles. Most people try to change what affects them. Media and international government policy. To address major social problems, movements have to address sources of power where they are. With the media and international government policy, power is now global. If power is global and you are local, you aren't going to make much change. The internet empowers people. Empirical research shows that people organize at local levels and then act globally. By organizing locally and acting globally through solidarity campaigns, human rights, etc., people find they can make a difference. Tuna, for example, the dolphin safe label was a global campaign that worked. Fishing companies changed their netting practices due to boycotting tuna in stores. To act on power, you have to act globally, but most people organize locally. The internet changes this. The internet is scalable. You can scale up and down depending on what you need, and it's around the same structure. Social movements, collective protests, political movements have worked historically by thinking globally and organizing locally. By thinking and organizing locally. Now, with the internet, it's possible to think globally. Code changes in networks. Values and codes are changing, organized around networking, and they're characterized by organizing locally and acting globally. To fight networks, you have to become networks. Presently, governments are still hierarchical and not very networked. Zapatistas in the internet. The Rand corporations, Archaea and Ronfield, researchers, identified Zapatistas as successfully using the internet for political purposes. Governments are desperately moving to think through the implications of networking. For governments to be flexible and reorganize is difficult. Bureaucracies and networks. The governmental machine is heavy. It was different when the government was a bureaucracy and political movements were bureaucratic. First, in a bureaucracy versus a bureaucracy, the government's bureaucracy wins through size. So, networks are different. Does the network lead or follow? The internet fits perfectly with social mobilization against globalization. Without the internet, movements couldn't act globally. Without the internet, movements couldn't work the way they work. The internet does more than facilitate, and it's indispensable. Citizens Network. In today's political system, people feel very alienated from government. There's an emergence of citizen computer networks which are directly linked to the emergence of computer networks. For example, the PEN program in Santa Monica, which began in the mid-90s. Actually in the mid-80s. PEN program. In 1986, community groups and citizens of Santa Monica set up PEN, P-E-N, Public Electronic Network. Homelessness and the homeless were given a voice. Through the PEN program, the city made sure homeless could access debates through telephone booths by giving them passwords, even if living on the street. Another famous experiment, the Seattle Community Network. Internet access for all. Mobilization against homelessness, it was called. Thousands and thousands of people proposed and mobilized many experiments. Cleveland, Ohio also organized a similar Internet access for all program. And the Amsterdam Digital City, started in 1994, still exists, attempted to create a related community network. It was and is conducted in Dutch. DDS is what it's called, for Die Digitale Stadt, and it was the most sophisticated community network at the time. DDS was an electronic community. Residents or visitors could participate as avatars, and it was based on the metaphor of the city. There were houses, cafes, city hall, political halls, billboards, a central station. And people who were residents could go into the halls. And there was a spatiality pattern. Spaces were assigned to homes where they then became property and could be lived in. Die Digitale Stadt started in Amsterdam in 1993 and 94, and it was pioneering because it created whole neighborhoods in a graphical interface connected by modems. In DDS, any home that was inactive for 3 months could be a squat. Divided homes could be turned into flats and subletted in different rooms, that is, different disk space. So it was a shared space. And as the city became denser and denser, the 140,000 residents at the time partitioned homes into more and more flats. It was the largest community network in the world. Of course, one could be from anywhere, so place was irrelevant, and it was accepted that you can reside there if you don't leave the community. 30% came from the Netherlands, and they elected a mayor electronically. DDS and sociability. Intense political events took place there. One could set up a home, a farm, post pictures. It was funded by the city of Amsterdam, and it was a demonstration and experiment in citizen participation. Residents of the digital city would have access to any city files in the digital archive, and citizens could go through the documents if they wanted to. It was also a huge success. It was the largest network in the world, and why was such an experience possible? Well, Amsterdam had two big traditions. First, it was a major computer science site with hackers who are politically active in third world issues, and it has a student computer culture that's related to that. And it also was a liberal environment with a strong squatters movement. DDS's origins begin in 1989 and 1990 with two important events, which developed into a strong cultural movement. In 1989, there was the Galactic Hackers Party, the first open online party. And in 1990, there was a cultural and political movement, the Zero Positive Ball. Folks with HIV/AIDS who were positive gathered, and it was a solidarity event. The US government had forbidden giving visas to Europeans with HIV. So in a way, it was also a political event. DDS's successes, they were connected in real time by computers over the net, and it created a connection between new causes and a social network for change. The Amsterdam digital experiment was so successful that the city of Amsterdam decided the inhabitants had to fund themselves, and they had to take over their own site so the city could stop financing it. There was a split, and Amsterdam community groups, hackers and citizens, split. Hackers created another system, a network with access for all, which was initially free, bought then by a Dutch telecom and paid for by advertising. And citizens stayed in DDS. The digital city itself became commercialized and a non-profit. there was a nonprofit for-profit. There was a split between community interests and commercial interests. Commercial interests. The digital city became entirely dependent on commercial dot-com companies. With the dot-com collapse in 2000, they closed due to a lack of money, and there's now a movement to try to restore it. Citizen participation is in decline, but at the same time, now there are thousands of community networks, both on the ground and digitally. Online communities. While DDS's significance as a pioneer seems over, there are thousands of communities like this around the world, such as Second Life, the digital world that is made in part by its owners, as well as owned. And people have the ability to connect local concerns and communities now through their computers.